He was 73 years old. He trusted his only son, and that son drove him up a desolate mountain, abandoned him in a freezing cabin, with no phone, no food, no fire, and disappeared with all his life savings, not a word of goodbye, not a single glance back. This story isn't about the deadly cold outside. It's about betrayal from one's own flesh and blood, and about an old man who decided not to die in silence. Like, comment with the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. I should have known something was wrong by the way Derek loaded the truck. He was too careful, too quiet. My son had never been a quiet man. Not when he was 9 years old slamming kitchen cabinets looking for snacks. Not when he was 34 arguing with me about money at the dinner table. Derek filled every room he walked into with noise, with movement, with that particular brand of energy that exhausted everyone around him while he somehow remained untouched by it. But that morning, when he showed up at my house at 6:15 with the truck already running and his jaw set like concrete, he didn't say much of anything. "Ready, Dad?" That was it. 2 words. I told myself it was early. I told myself he was tired. I told myself a lot of things that morning that I now understand were just my mind protecting itself from what it already knew but couldn't bring itself to say out loud. My name is Harold Whitmore. I am 73 years old. I spent 41 years working as a civil engineer for Callaway County, designing bridges and drainage systems that most people drive over without a second thought. I raised one son after my wife Patricia died of a brain aneurysm when Derek was 11. I did it alone, with no family nearby and not much money, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I did it perfectly, because I didn't. I worked too much. I missed school plays. I handed him cash when I should have handed him time. I told myself I was providing. I told myself that was enough. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe that's what he'd tell you if you asked him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That October morning, a Saturday, the 8th, I remember because it was 2 weeks after my birthday, Derek told me he was taking me on a fall getaway. His words exactly. "A fall getaway, Dad, just the two of us. Fresh air, mountain views. You've been cooped up too long." He said it a week before, over the phone, and I remember feeling something loosen in my chest when he said it, a kind of cautious warmth, because Derek and I had been distant for a while. Not fighting, just drifting. The way a boat drifts from a dock when nobody notices the rope has come loose. I was glad he called. I was glad he wanted to spend time together. I packed a bag the night before like I was 25 years old going on vacation, folding my flannel shirts with more care than they deserved. The drive up took about 2.5 hours. We went north on Route 9, then climbed into the Callaway mountain range on roads that got narrower and less maintained the higher we went. I watched the trees thicken and the sky press down lower and the last gas station disappear in the passenger side mirror, and I remember thinking it was beautiful. October in the mountains is its own kind of brutal beauty. The leaves burning orange and red before they fall, the cold already sharpening the air. I rolled the window down a little just to smell it. Derek drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward. "You doing okay?" I asked him somewhere around the hour mark. "Fine." He glanced at me once, then back at the road. "Just focused on driving. The roads get tricky up here." "I know. I've driven these before." I paused. "Your mother and I used to come up this way when you were little, before she got sick." He didn't say anything to that. I watched his jaw move slightly, like he was chewing on something he'd decided not to swallow. We drove the rest of the way in near silence. I told myself again that he was just tired. The cabin sat at the end of a private road that I didn't recognize, tucked behind a stand of old pines so dense they blocked out most of the gray October sky. It was a small structure, 2 rooms from the look of it, wooden siding gone dark with age and moisture, a rusted propane tank chained to the side. There was a woodpile under a tarp near the front, a single window facing the access road, the glass clouded with frost already forming at the edges, even though it was barely 10 in the morning. "Whose place is this?" I asked, as Derek pulled the truck up close to the door. "Friend of mine. He said we could use it." Derek put the truck in park and got out before I'd even unhooked my seatbelt. I climbed down carefully, my left knee has given me trouble for years, and stood looking at the cabin. Something about it felt off in a way I couldn't name. It felt unused in a way that went beyond seasonal emptiness. There was no welcome mat. The windows were too dark. The whole place had the feel of somewhere people go when they don't want to be found. "Let's get the bags inside," Derek said. He already had mine out of the truck bed. He carried my bag in. I carried a plastic grocery bag with some food I'd packed. Crackers, a tin of sardines, some apples. Inside the cabin was cold. Not just morning cold, but a deep cold that told you the heat hadn't been on in a long time. There was a small iron wood stove in the corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a cot pushed against one wall. No running water visible, no electricity that I could see. A single oil lantern on the table, unlit. "This is rustic," I said. Derek set my bag down on the cot. He didn't look at me when he answered. "Yeah, sorry about that. The appeal is the quiet, I guess." "Where are your bags?" A pause, very small. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but I had spent 41 years watching engineers hide mistakes in blueprints, and I knew the specific silence of someone reaching for a version of the truth they could live with. "They're still in the truck," he said. "I'll grab them in a minute." He walked back outside. I stood in the middle of that cold room and watched through the clouded window as he got back into the truck and, instead of going around to the back, climbed straight into the driver's seat. My brain didn't process it right away. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't hit you like a punch. It moves slower than that. It seeps in. I watched the truck back down the access road. I thought, he's just turning around. He'll pull forward and park better. The truck kept backing up until it reached the bend in the road, then straightened out, and then it was just taillights through the pine trees, red and steady, and then nothing at all. I stood at that window for a long moment. My hand was still holding the plastic grocery bag. I could feel the apples pressing against the side through the thin plastic. Then I went to the door and opened it and called out his name. My voice went into the trees, and the trees took it and gave me nothing back. I want to tell you that I immediately sprang into action. I want to tell you that 73 years of living had given me some kind of iron composure, some deep reserve of calm that I could draw on in a moment like that. But the truth is, I sat down on that cot, and I stayed there for a while. I don't know exactly how long. Long enough for the cold in the room to become something I couldn't ignore anymore. Long enough for the particular silence of the woods to stop feeling like quiet and start feeling like a wall closing in. The first practical thing I did was check my phone. No signal. Not one bar. I walked to every corner of that 2-room cabin and held the phone up at different angles and found nothing. I went back outside and stood in the small clearing in front of the cabin and turned slowly in a full circle. Nothing. Whatever carrier I was on, this place was outside its reach. The mountains blocked everything. Or maybe that was intentional. Maybe Derek had chosen this exact spot because he knew what the signal situation was. That thought, maybe Derek had chosen this, was the first moment the full weight of what was happening started to settle on me like the cold was settling into my bones. I went back inside and sat down again and made myself think it through. He had taken the truck. He had left no phone. He had brought me here. Why? My mind kept sliding off the obvious answer, the way your foot slides when you step on ice. I kept trying to find other explanations. He had an emergency, he panicked, he'd be back. But underneath those explanations was the one I didn't want to face. That my son had driven me 2.5 hours into the mountains on a Saturday morning and left me in a cold cabin with no means of communication and no easy way out. That whatever reasons existed, they had been planned. That the quiet during the drive hadn't been tiredness. I pressed my palms against my thighs and breathed. I was 73 years old, alone, in the Callaway mountain range in October. My phone was useless. I had no idea whose cabin this was or how to find help. The nearest road I'd seen of any size was probably 8 or 10 miles back down the mountain. My left knee was not going to let me walk 8 miles on rough terrain without a serious fight. I had a bag with enough clothes for a long weekend. I had crackers, sardines, and a handful of apples. I could fall apart, or I could think. I chose to think, mostly because falling apart didn't seem like it would accomplish much. First, heat. The wood stove was the immediate priority. I was already cold enough that my fingers were stiffening at the joints. and the temperature was only going to drop as the day moved toward afternoon and then evening. I found the tarp-covered woodpile outside. There was a reasonable supply, enough for several days if I was careful, and whoever had built the pile had been smart enough to cover it properly so it had stayed mostly dry. There were matches in a tin on the shelf above the wood stove, along with a half-used box of fire starters. I got a fire going on the second attempt. It took longer than it should have because my hands were shaking, and I'm not entirely sure the shaking was only from the cold. Second, water. I found a hand pump at a utility sink. Old iron, the kind you prime by pouring water in first. Behind the cabin was a large barrel that caught roof runoff, and it still had several inches of water in it that hadn't frozen yet. I used a coffee can I found under the sink to prime the pump, and after 4 or 5 tries it began to pull. The water was cold and tasted like iron pipes, but it ran clear. I filled every container I could find, a dented pot, a mason jar, a plastic bottle that had been left on the shelf. Third, take stock of the food. Crackers, 1 package, maybe 200 calories worth. Sardines, 2 tins. Apples, 4. There was also, on the shelf behind the mason jar, a half bag of rice and a small can of black beans I hadn't brought with me. Someone had left them. Not much, but better than nothing. Better than nothing was a phrase I was going to be repeating to myself a lot in the coming hours. Fourth, plan. This was the hard part. I sat at the wooden table with the lantern going and the wood stove beginning to put out its first cautious warmth, and I tried to think about what Derek had actually done and what that meant for me practically. If he'd taken the truck and gone back down the mountain, the most optimistic version of the story was that he'd had some kind of breakdown, some kind of panic, and he'd turn around and come back, maybe hours from now, maybe tomorrow. I gave that version about a 10% chance of being true, and only because I wasn't willing to give it 0. The other 90% was harder. If this wasn't an impulse, if he had planned this, then it meant he had thought through what would happen to me out here, which meant he either believed I would find my way out, or he didn't care if I didn't. I sat with that for a minute. I sat with the idea that my son might have driven me up here and left me knowing full well that an old man with a bad knee and no phone signal might not make it out before the temperatures got dangerous. I tried to find a third option. I couldn't. The thing about Derek, and I need you to understand this before I can tell you the rest, is that he had never been a cruel person on the surface. That was what made it so hard to see coming. He was charming, actually. He'd always been charming. He had his mother's dark eyes and her ability to make you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room when he turned his attention on you. When he was young, that quality had made him popular. With teachers, with friends, with women. He'd had an easy social grace that I'd always admired because I never possessed it myself. I was never the charming one. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the one who showed up and did the work. But somewhere along the way, I couldn't have told you exactly when. Looking back, I could see the gradual shift, but I'd never marked the moment. The charm had started working for him in ways that cost other people. He'd borrowed money from friends and paid them back late, then not at all, and explained it smoothly enough that people forgave him before they realized they'd been had. He'd had jobs he left under circumstances he was vague about. He'd had a marriage, a short one, to a woman named Carla, that ended with her moving 3 states away and him never mentioning her again. He'd moved back home 2 years ago. 46 years old, moving back in with his father. He told me it was temporary. He told me he was between opportunities. I told him, of course, stay as long as you need, and I told myself that this was what fathers did. They held the door open. You don't stop being someone's parent just because they turn 46. He'd been helpful at first. He'd driven me to appointments. He'd done some yard work. He'd cooked dinner twice a week, and they were good dinners. Derek could cook. He'd gotten that from Patricia. And we'd sit at the table and eat and talk about nothing in particular, and I had thought more than once that maybe something between us was finally repairing itself. And all the while, I know now, he was watching. He was learning the layout of my finances the way a man surveys land before he starts digging. He was watching me log into my bank accounts, and he was noting my passwords. He was going through papers in my office late at night when he thought I was asleep. He was building his map. I didn't know any of that yet, sitting in that cabin. But I was beginning, in the animal way that comes before actual understanding, to feel the shape of it. Because the question that kept coming back to me as I sat at that table in the firelight was this: why would Derek do this? Not in the emotional sense, in the practical sense. If this was planned, then it had an objective. People don't plan things without objectives. And the objective, if I forced myself to look at it directly, had to be something about money. My money. I had spent 41 years as a county engineer and I had lived carefully. Patricia's life insurance had helped, and I'd invested it conservatively and let it sit and compound over the years. My house, a 3-bedroom on Carmody Street that Patricia and I had bought in 1987, was paid off. I had a pension, modest but reliable. I had a savings account with enough in it that, if Derek had found it and cleaned it out, he would have had a very significant reason to want me somewhere remote and unreachable for a while. The thought landed in my stomach like a stone into cold water. I was sitting in a frozen cabin in the mountains because my son had needed time. Time to do something. Time to move money, destroy documents, disappear with whatever he'd taken before anyone could ask questions. And what better way to buy time than to leave the one person who might immediately notice something was wrong somewhere he couldn't make phone calls? It was so cold in that cabin, even with the fire going, that I could see my breath. I pressed my forehead down against the rough wood of the table and stayed that way for a long moment. Then I sat back up. I was not going to die in this place. I was not going to give him that. The first night was the worst. I fed the wood stove through the evening, keeping the fire alive with a concentration that kept other thoughts at bay, at least for minutes at a time. I ate half the crackers and 1 tin of sardines, measured out carefully because I didn't know how many days I needed to stretch what I had. I drank iron-tasting water. I piled every piece of clothing from my bag onto the cot and lay under them fully dressed, boots and all, and listened to the wind begin to work itself up outside the cabin walls. The wind up in the Callaway Mountains at elevation in October is not the wind you hear from inside a well-insulated house. It has a particular sound, a low, cycling moan that finds every gap in the wood, every crack in the chinked walls, and forces cold air through them like it has something to prove. The cabin's seams were old and imperfect, and the cold pressed in steadily, and even with the stove I'd guess the temperature in that room never climbed much above 40 degrees. I did not sleep much. My knee ached with the cold. My mind wouldn't stop building and rebuilding the same picture. Derek's hands on the steering wheel, Derek's jaw set, Derek's taillights disappearing into the trees. I kept going back to a moment maybe 8 months earlier. Derek had asked me very casually about power of attorney. He'd framed it as concern. "Dad, if something happened to you, it would be much easier to handle things if I had some legal standing. You should think about it. A lot of people set this up." I told him I'd think about it. I hadn't thought about it because I'd had no intention of doing it, because something about the way he'd asked had made me uneasy in a way I hadn't let myself fully examine at the time. Had he been more patient that time? Had he waited and then decided a simpler route? In the dark of that cabin, I turned the question over and over. Sometime around what I estimated was 2 in the morning, I got up and fed more wood to the stove, watched the fire catch and push back the darkness for another few hours, and then went back to the cot and stared at the ceiling and made myself a promise. If I got out of here, when I got out of here, I was not going to run away from what had happened. I was not going to find an explanation that let Derek off the hook because it was easier to believe in a misunderstanding than in what I was increasingly certain this was. I had spent too many years finding explanations for Derek. I was done with that. The cold deepened toward morning. The fire held. I held with it. By the second morning, I had a clearer head, which turned out to mean a more frightening picture. I had gone over my options methodically while lying awake, the way I used to go over engineering problems, removing emotion from the calculation and looking at the structure of the situation. The structure was this. I was at an elevation of approximately, based on the drive and what I knew of the Callaway Range, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 feet. The access road that Derek had used was unpaved and probably not on any map a casual person would have. The nearest paved road was, by my estimate, somewhere between 6 and 10 miles downhill. My left knee would allow walking, but not fast and not without significant pain at any real distance. October temperatures at this elevation would be in the mid-20s at night and the upper 30s or low 40s during the day at best, and the sky I'd seen through the window that morning had the particular gray-white opacity that suggested weather coming. If weather came, if it snowed with any seriousness, the access road would become nearly impassable on foot. And if I waited too long hoping for rescue that might never come, I would exhaust my food supply and potentially my wood supply before I'd made any decision at all. I needed to try for the road, but I also couldn't ignore the possibility that the attempt itself might be what killed me, not the waiting. A man of 73 with a bad knee, undertaking a 10-mile hike in October mountain conditions with no map and inadequate gear, was not a man in a strong position. I spent an hour going through the cabin more carefully than I had the first evening, hoping I'd missed something useful. I had, in a metal box under the cot, hidden well enough that I wouldn't have found it by accident, I found a coil of thin rope, a folding knife, a box of waterproof matches, and a worn topographic map of the Callaway mountain range. The map was old, its folds worn nearly through, but it was legible. I spread it on the table and found my approximate location by tracing the access roads and matching the elevation lines to the terrain I'd seen during the drive up. If I was where I thought I was, the closest paved road was 8 miles southwest. There was another possibility, a fire service road marked on the map that crossed the ridge about 3 miles east of the cabin. Fire service roads were maintained. Fire service roads sometimes had traffic. 3 miles was different from 8, but 3 miles east meant climbing first, then descending on the other side of the ridge. In my current condition, going up was its own kind of problem. I was still working through the calculation when I heard it. A sound. Outside. Distant but distinct. A vehicle engine. I was out the door before I'd consciously decided to move, standing in the clearing in the sharp morning cold, turning toward the sound, every cell in my body focused on it. It was coming from the direction of the access road, not from above, not from the fire road, but from below. From the direction Derek had gone, coming up the road. My heart did something complicated and fast inside my chest. It could be Derek, coming back, either to make this right or to make sure I couldn't tell anyone what he'd done. I grabbed the folding knife from my pocket. I didn't know what I intended to do with it. I am not a violent man, and stood in the clearing and waited. The vehicle that came around the bend was not Derek's truck. It was a Greene County Ranger pickup, and the woman behind the wheel had the expression of someone who had already decided today was going to be difficult before she'd gotten out of bed that morning. She was maybe late 30s, with dark hair pulled back under a green cap and the kind of wind-burned complexion you get from spending a significant portion of your life outdoors. She pulled up, cut the engine, and got out, and she looked at me standing in the clearing with a folding knife in my hand, and then at the smoke coming out of the cabin's stovepipe, and she said, "Sir, this cabin is county property. It's been closed since June. Who are you, and how did you get up here?" My voice, when it came, was steadier than I expected. "My name is Harold Whitmore," I said. "I'm a civil engineer, retired. My son drove me up here 2 days ago and left me. I have no phone signal. I've been trying to figure out how to walk out." Something shifted in her face. The professional assessment recalibrated. She looked at me. At the age in my face, at my coat that wasn't quite warm enough, at whatever she could read in the way I was standing. "Are you hurt?" she said. "Not badly. Cold. My knee is giving me trouble." "Let's get you inside," she said. "My name is Lena Brooks. I'm a wildlife ranger for Callaway County." She paused. "I'm going to need you to tell me everything." I looked at her for a moment. I looked at the green truck. I looked at the trees and the white October sky above them, at the mountain sitting around me with its indifferent weight. "That's going to take a while," I said. "That's okay," said Lena Brooks. She held the cabin door open and didn't rush me. "I've got time." I walked inside. I sat down at the table, and for the first time in 2 days I began to believe that I might actually survive this. But what I didn't know yet, what Lena would begin to show me over the next few hours, piece by careful piece, was that surviving wasn't going to be the hard part. The hard part was what I was going to find out about exactly what Derek had done while he'd had me trapped on that mountain. That part hadn't even started yet. Lena Brooks was not the kind of woman who asked questions she didn't intend to follow through on. I learned that within the first 10 minutes of sitting across from her at that rough wooden table, the wood stove pushing out heat between us while the October wind worked at the cabin walls. She had a small notepad, the spiral-bound kind rangers carry in their breast pockets, and she set it on the table but didn't open it right away. She just looked at me first, the way a person looks at something they're trying to measure before they commit to a number. "You said your son drove you up here," she said. "When exactly?" "Saturday morning, the 8th. She glanced at her watch. "That makes it 41 hours, roughly." "About that." "What did you eat?" "Crackers, 2 tins of sardines, apples, some rice I boiled last night. There was a half bag on the shelf." She looked at the shelf, then back at me. "You found the map under the cot?" "This morning, yes." "You were going to try the fire road." "I was still deciding," I said. "My knee isn't good, but I wasn't going to wait forever." She wrote something in the notepad. Then she said, without looking up, "What's your son's name?" Derek Whitmore. He's 46. He drove a gray pickup, late model, I don't know the year exactly, crew cab. And he just left you here." He pulled in, carried my bag inside, and left. Didn't say anything, just got in the truck and back down the road. Lena stopped writing. She looked up at me, and the professional distance in her expression shifted slightly. Not to pity, which I would have hated, but to something more like careful attention, like she was resetting her assumptions. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "before I radio this in, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly. Was there any argument? Any situation where he might have thought you were staying voluntarily?" I understood why she had to ask. I looked at her steadily. "No. He didn't ask me if I wanted to stay. He didn't say he was leaving. He carried my bag in, walked back out, and drove away. I watched through that window." I pointed. "He didn't look back." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and picked up the radio on her belt. "Dispatch, this is Brooks. I'm at County Parcel 7 Foxtrot on the North Callaway Ridge access. I have a civilian, male, elderly, 40-plus hours exposure. He's ambulatory, no serious injury reported. I need a welfare check initiated, and I need you to run a name for me." She read off Derek's name and the truck description, and then she gave me a look while she waited for the acknowledgement that said, "We're just getting started." She was right. We were. She made me eat before she let me talk through the whole story. She had a pack in the truck, the efficient kind that rangers carry when they expect to spend time in the field. And she pulled out a thermal pouch of soup and heated it on the wood stove and put it in front of me without asking if I wanted it. It was chicken something, out of a foil packet, and it tasted like the best thing I had eaten in years. I held the cup in both hands and felt the heat move through my palms and into my arms, and I had to stop for a moment because I was embarrassingly close to not being composed. "Take your time," Lena said, without making it a thing. I drank the soup, then I talked. I told her about Derek moving back in 2 years ago. I told her about the power of attorney conversation, how he'd brought it up casually, and how I'd deflected it and let the subject drop. I told her about the way he'd been in the weeks leading up to that Saturday. Quieter than usual, more helpful in ways that I could now see had a particular quality of distraction to them, like a man performing tasks while his mind was somewhere else entirely. I told her about how good the drive had seemed, the fall colors on the mountain, how I had sat in that passenger seat thinking something might be healing between us. I stopped there. Not because I'd run out of things to say, but because that image, me sitting in the truck thinking we were getting better, had a specific kind of pain attached to it that I had to be careful with. Lena didn't rush me. She wrote steadily in her notepad. "You mentioned money," she said when I continued. "You think he went into your accounts?" "I don't know for certain. I haven't been able to check anything." I set the cup down. "But I have a savings account at Callaway Federal. I have a pension account I haven't touched in several years. My house on Carmody Street is paid off. If Derek had access to any of my financial passwords..." I stopped. "He lived in my house for 2 years. I'm not as careful about those things as I should have been." The way Lena's pen paused on the notepad told me that landed with weight. Do you have a lawyer? She asked. Anyone with power over your accounts in an emergency? My neighbor Margaret keeps a key to my house and has my attorney's number. She doesn't know my account numbers, but my attorney does. I have a letter with him outlining my assets. I paused. If Derek is doing what I think he's doing, he would need time. He needed me unreachable while he moved things. Lena looked up from the notepad. And leaving you up here gave him that time. Yes. She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed at the cabin, and the pines made a sound like water running over stones, and the gray sky pressed down over all of it. Then she said quietly, but plainly, Mr. Whitmore, I've been a ranger for 14 years. I've found people in the backcountry in bad shape for a lot of different reasons. Accidents, exposure, disorientation. I've never taken a report quite like this one. I imagine not, I said. I believe you, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not going to spend time looking for another explanation. What you're describing has a specific shape to it, and that shape has a name. I nodded. I knew the name. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. Lena said it for me. Elder financial abuse. And if he left you up here as part of it, we add endangerment. She closed the notepad. Let's get you down the mountain. We'll make calls on the way. The drive down took 40 minutes on roads that were rougher than I'd registered coming up, because going up you don't notice what the downhill is going to be like. Lena drove carefully, both hands on the wheel like Derek had driven, but for entirely different reasons. She was watching the road, watching the weather, watching the drop-off on the passenger side where the mountain fell away into a steep ravine thick with old trees. I watched it too and thought about what 8 or 10 miles of that on foot would have looked like for a man with a bad knee and not enough food. She let me use her personal cell phone, satellite boosted, the kind of equipment county rangers carry in dead zones, once we dropped below the worst of the elevation. The first call I made was to my attorney, a man named Gerald Spence, who had handled my affairs for 20 years and who picked up on the third ring because Gerald always picked up. I told him where I'd been. I told him what I suspected. There was a silence on Gerald's end that told me, before he said a single word, that the situation was already worse than suspected. Harold, he said carefully, I'm glad you're safe. I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay steady when I say it. Say it. Margaret called my office yesterday. She'd been trying to reach you since Saturday and was worried. I pulled your account information this morning. I have authorization to check in emergencies. And Harold, your savings account at Callaway Federal shows a withdrawal of the entire balance on Saturday afternoon. The truck's heater was running. It was warm in the cab. I was cold anyway. How much? I said. Gerald told me. I had 71 years of practice not showing everything I felt, and I used all of it in that moment. Lena was watching the road. I watched the trees going past the window. Is it gone? I asked. Or transferred? The withdrawal was made in cash equivalents. A cashier's check, drawn to a numbered account. Harold, someone with your account number and PIN and the answers to your security questions walked into that branch Saturday afternoon and cleaned it out. They had everything they needed. The teller flagged it, but the bank's fraud hold policy has a 48-hour window, and Derek, if it was Derek, was in and out before... It was Derek, I said. Gerald was quiet for a second. I've already put a freeze on the pension account. He hadn't touched that yet. And the house, the deed is still in your name. I checked. Another pause. Harold, the amount in that savings account, that was almost everything you had liquid. I know what was in there, Gerald. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry yet. Be useful. My voice was harder than I intended it to be. Not at Gerald, at the situation, at the image assembling itself in my mind. Derek walking into Callaway Federal on a Saturday afternoon in a calm, unhurried way, with my PIN in his memory and my whole financial life about to fit into a cashier's check he could fold into his coat pocket. Call the bank. Tell them I was unreachable because I was left on a mountain. Tell them this was not authorized. And then call the county sheriff's department because I'm about to give them a statement and I want you available. Already dialing, Gerald said, and I believed him. I handed the phone back to Lena. She had the careful expression of someone who had heard enough to understand the shape of the damage without needing all the details. Bad, she said. He took the savings account, My attorney froze the pension account in time. I pressed my palm flat against my thigh. The house is still mine. That's something. Yes, I said. That's something. We drove the rest of the way down in a focused quiet, not an uncomfortable silence, more like the quiet of two people who both understand that a situation has escalated beyond conversation and into action. But Lena took me to the Callaway County Ranger Station rather than the hospital because I insisted I didn't need a hospital and because the ranger station was where the sheriff's deputy was already waiting. His name was Deputy Croft, young, mid-30s, with a careful manner that suggested he'd learned to keep his reactions neutral while he gathered information. He had a thermos of coffee, and he poured me a cup without asking and set it in front of me at the station's small conference table, which I took as a good sign about his instincts. I gave him the full statement. All of it. The call from Derek asking about the fall getaway, the drive up, the cabin, the 41 hours alone with the cold and the shrinking food supply, the conversation with Gerald, the cashier's check, the PIN, which I had never given Derek, but which he had clearly observed over 2 years of living in my house. Croft wrote everything down. He didn't express disbelief or unnecessary sympathy. He asked precise questions. Did Derek have a key to my house? Yes, he'd had one since he moved in, and I hadn't asked for it back. Did I know if he had any other banking information? I didn't know the full extent of what he'd accessed, but I knew he'd spent enough time in my office. Did I have any reason to believe he'd left the state? That I didn't know. He stepped out to make calls. Lena sat with me. "You're handling this remarkably well," she said. She wasn't flattering me. It was the observational tone she'd used throughout. "I'm not," I said. "I'm managing it well. Those aren't the same thing." She thought about that. "Fair point." "I keep thinking about the drive up," I said. He was quiet the whole way and I kept making excuses for it. I told myself he was tired. I told myself early mornings make him quiet. I turned the coffee cup in my hands. I've spent 46 years making excuses for that boy. "He's not a boy," Lena said, not unkindly. "No, he isn't." I set the coffee down. "He's a middle-aged man who planned this, who figured out my passwords and drove me to an abandoned cabin and left me with enough food to survive maybe 3 days and no way to call anyone. He thought about this. He decided it was acceptable." I paused. That's the part I keep getting stuck on. Not the money, the deciding. That he looked at the math of it and said yes. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "People who do what your son did, they almost always tell themselves a story where it makes sense, where they deserve it somehow, where the other person isn't quite real enough to count. He needed me out of the way." "He needed you silent," she said. Out of the way would have been a vacation. Silent was the specific thing. That distinction hit me somewhere precise and deep. She was right. A vacation would have meant I was reachable. What he'd chosen meant I was gone. Whether I came back from it or not had apparently been a secondary consideration. Croft came back in with a legal pad and a look that told me the calls had been productive. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, pulling out a chair, "we've confirmed a Derek Allen Whitmore used a cashier's check from Callaway Federal on Saturday at 3:18 in the afternoon. The amount matches what your attorney told you. We've also got a hit on his vehicle, a gray 2019 Silverado, registered to Derek Whitmore at your Carmody Street address, flagged at a toll booth on Interstate 78, heading east Saturday evening around 7 p.m. He looked at his notes. That puts him roughly 4 hours east of Callaway at last record. He was already running, I said. Looks that way. We've contacted the State Financial Crimes Unit and we're working on a warrant. The cashier's check. Those can be traced if they haven't been cashed yet, and they usually can't be cashed immediately without proper banking channels. He glanced at Lena, then back at me. There's one more thing. The way he said it made me set down the coffee cup. Your son filed an emergency petition for guardianship of you, Croft said, with the county probate court. Filed it Thursday, 2 days before he drove you up the mountain. The filing states that you have demonstrated cognitive decline and are unable to manage your own affairs. The room did something strange for a moment, like the walls moved inward a half inch and then settled back. Cognitive decline, I said. Yes, sir. I designed drainage infrastructure for 41 years. I managed every financial account I've ever held without a single error. I just survived 41 hours alone in a cabin in the Callaway Mountains using a topographic map and a hand pump. My voice was level. I made sure of it. On what basis did he file that claim? He had a letter, Croft said, from a Dr. Emmett Pryor, stating he had evaluated you and found evidence of, I have never seen a doctor named Emmett Pryor in my life. Croft nodded slowly. That's going to be important. He wrote something on his legal pad. If that evaluation was falsified, we're adding document fraud to the financial crimes. Mr. Whitmore, your son wasn't just trying to take your money. He was trying to take your legal standing. If that guardianship petition had gone through before anyone knew where you were, he would have had control of everything, I said. My accounts, my house, my medical decisions, and I would have been in a cabin on a mountain with no way to contest it. The silence that followed that statement had a particular weight. Even Lena, who had kept her composure throughout, pressed her lips together and looked at the table for a moment. He thought about this for a long time, I said. Not a question. The petition alone takes preparation, Croft said. Getting a physician to sign off to real or forged. That's not something you do in a week. Months. He had been living in my house for 2 years, eating at my table, driving me to appointments, and for some significant portion of that time he had been building this. The fall getaway, the empty cabin, the cashier's check, the guardianship filing, the forged medical letter, it was a structure. It had layers. You don't build something with layers without spending time on the architecture. I thought about all the evenings he'd cooked dinner and we'd talked about nothing. I thought about how I had sat across from him at my own kitchen table and thought we were getting better. He had been at work the whole time. Lena drove me to Carmody Street that evening. Gerald was already there, standing on the porch with his briefcase and the expression of a man who had spent several hours on the phone doing damage control. Margaret from next door came out when she saw the Ranger truck pull up, and she stood at the end of the walk with her hands clasped and her face full of a complicated relief. My house was as I'd left it Saturday morning. Derek had taken what he needed. I would discover later that he'd gone through my office and removed several paper documents, my secondary banking card, and a folder where I'd kept old financial records. But he hadn't taken anything visible, anything that would have told Margaret something was wrong when she'd looked through the front window. He'd taken the things that were useful to him. He'd left everything else standing. Gerald walked me through the damage at the kitchen table while Lena waited in the living room and Margaret made coffee she hadn't been asked to make, the way neighbors do when they don't know what else to offer. The savings account was the primary hit. The pension account was frozen and intact. Derek hadn't moved fast enough there. The house was untouched legally. The guardianship petition had been filed but not yet heard, and with the fraud evidence Croft was building, Gerald was confident it would be dismissed. My regular checking account, a small one I used for everyday expenses, had been accessed but showed only a small withdrawal, which Gerald thought meant Derek had focused on the big prize and not bothered with the loose change. The cashier's check is the key, Gerald said. If we can establish it was fraudulently obtained, which the bank's record should support, given the circumstances, we have a case for full recovery. It's not instant, it's not clean, but it's there. How long? I said. Months, possibly longer if he fights it. But Harold? Gerald leaned forward slightly. The guardianship filing changes the nature of this. That moves it from financial fraud into something more serious. That's premeditated. That's a long game. I know, I said. He expected you not to come back, Gerald said, and his voice was careful when he said it, like he was handing me something fragile. I know that too, I said. Margaret set a mug of coffee in front of me and put her hand briefly on my shoulder, a gentle pressure that she removed before it became something I'd have to respond to. Small mercies. I was holding together, but I was holding together the way old timber holds together. The structure is sound, but there are more seams than there used to be. Lena appeared in the kitchen doorway. I need to head back to the station, she said. Deputy Croft will be in touch tomorrow. The warrant for Derek's financial records should come through in the next 24 hours. Thank you, I said. for finding me." She looked at me for a moment. "I was checking on unauthorized use of county property. You just happened to be there." The corner of her mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. "Get some sleep, Mr. Whitmore. You look like you've earned it." She left. I heard the truck start and pull away from the curb. Margaret and Gerald stayed another hour, which was the right amount of time. Margaret talked about nothing important in a way that filled the silence without demanding anything from me, and Gerald reviewed the immediate protective steps he'd taken on the accounts, and I sat at my kitchen table and drank the coffee and let the ordinary sounds of my house settle around me. When they finally left, I sat alone in the kitchen for a while. I thought about Derek at 18, coming home from his first job with a paycheck and an expression that was equal parts pride and surprise. Like he'd done something and it had worked, and the world hadn't punished him for trying. I thought about the night Patricia died, the two of us sitting in the hospital parking lot because neither of us could figure out how to go inside and come back out, as people who didn't have her anymore. I thought about all the ordinary Tuesday evenings and unremarkable Saturdays and small, ordinary moments that had been real, that had happened, that couldn't be undone by what he'd done later. None of that made what he'd done lighter, but it made it more complicated, and complicated was harder to carry than simple in some ways. I went to the bathroom and washed my face with warm water. I looked at myself in the mirror, the age in the creases around my eyes, the gray that had been coming in steadily for years, the particular expression of a man who has used up a specific kind of patience and doesn't intend to replenish it. I was 73 years old. He had left me on a mountain in October, and he had not, despite his planning and his forged letter and his cashier's check, quite managed to make it permanent. I turned off the bathroom light and went to get ready for bed. My knee ached with the familiar cold weather complaint. I was home. I was standing, and somewhere out on Interstate 78, Derek was still running east with a check in his pocket and a story he'd told himself where any of this made sense. He would find out soon enough that the story had holes in it. They always do. I slept 9 hours that first night home, which surprised me. I had expected to lie awake with my mind running the same loops it had been running for 2 days. The truck pulling away, the taillights through the pines, Derek's jaw set like concrete on that drive up. Instead, I was asleep before 10, and I didn't move until almost 7 the next morning, when the October light came through the bedroom curtains, and my knee woke me up with its usual cold weather complaint, and for about 4 seconds, I didn't remember any of it. Those 4 seconds were the last easy thing for a while. Gerald called at 8:15. Deputy Croft called at 8:40. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad of my own, a cup of coffee going cold beside it, and the particular focused calm of a man who has decided that grief is something he'll schedule for later. The warrant for Derek's financial records had come through overnight. That was Croft's news, delivered in the careful tone of someone who had learned not to lead with the worst of it. What the record showed was, in his words, more extensive than initially indicated. He asked if he could come by that morning with someone from the State Financial Crimes Unit. I said yes. I made a second pot of coffee because it seemed like the right thing to do, and then I sat and waited and watched the maple in the front yard drop leaves in the October wind, and I thought about how Patricia had loved that tree. She would have known what to do with all of this. Not in a practical sense. Gerald handled the practical. But Patricia had a way of naming things directly that I had never quite developed. She would have sat across from me at this table and said, "Harold, your son tried to kill you for money," and let those words sit in the air without dressing them up. And somehow that directness would have made it possible to move through instead of around. I had spent 40 years moving around things I should have moved through. That habit had costs I was still counting. The 2 men arrived at 9:30. Croft I recognized. The other man, the financial crimes investigator, was named Aldridge, mid-50s, with the slightly rumpled look of someone who spent more time reading documents than talking to people. He carried a briefcase and a laptop and set both on my kitchen table with the efficiency of a man who had done this in a lot of people's kitchens and had learned to be useful quickly. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, shaking my hand, "I'm going to show you some things this morning that are going to be difficult to look at. I want you to know that everything we're showing you has evidentiary value, and your reactions and confirmations are part of building this case. So if you need to stop and take a minute at any point, that's fine, but I do need you present and I need your input. Understood, I said. Show me. Aldridge opened the laptop. What Derek had done was not a spontaneous decision made in a moment of desperation. What the financial records showed was a timeline that began not 2 years ago when he moved in, but 3.5 years ago, before he'd even asked to come back home. Aldridge walked me through it with the methodical patience of a man reading a blueprint, and I sat and listened and felt each piece land the way a structural failure lands. Not all at once, but in sequence, one support giving way, and then the next, the whole thing coming apart in an order that, in retrospect, makes terrible sense. 3.5 years ago, Derek had opened a shell company. Aldridge showed me the registration documents. A limited liability company called Whitmore Property Consulting, registered in a neighboring state under Derek's name and a business address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. The company had no employees, no actual business activity, no website. It existed on paper. That was its only purpose, to exist on paper and to have a bank account. A shell company for what? I said, though I was already beginning to understand. For receiving transfers, Aldridge said. He pulled up a second document. About 18 months ago, several months before he moved back into your house, small transfers began leaving your savings account at Callaway Federal. Nothing dramatic at first. $200, $350. Once, $400. The intervals were irregular, which is intentional. Irregular transfers are harder to flag in automated fraud detection than regular ones. I looked at the table of transfers on the screen. There were dozens of them. He had my account information 18 months ago, I said. He had your online banking login credentials 18 months ago, Aldridge corrected carefully, which means he'd had access to them before that, long enough to set up the transfer structure and test it. I thought about the year before Derek moved in. He'd been visiting more frequently, dropping by, staying for dinner, helping me set up a new laptop when my old one died. I had sat right there at this table and let him help me transfer my bookmarks and my saved passwords to the new machine. I had handed it to him. I hadn't known I was doing it, but I had handed it to him. The small transfers total about $42,000 over the 18-month period, Aldridge said. Moved in increments small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, deposited into the Whitmore Property Consulting account, then moved again into a personal account in Derek's name at a different bank. $42,000. Gone in pieces, 200 at a time, while he sat at my kitchen table eating dinners he'd cooked and asking how I was sleeping. And then Saturday, I said. Saturday was the main event, Aldridge said. The cashier's check was for the remaining balance. Once the small transfers had reduced your savings to its current level, he needed you unreachable while he cashed the check and moved the funds offshore before the bank's fraud hold window closed. He paused. The check was deposited into an account at a bank in another state on Sunday morning. The funds were wired internationally Sunday afternoon. We've issued a hold request through the International Banking Cooperative, but I want to be honest with you. Recovery of those specific funds is not guaranteed. It depends on which jurisdiction they landed in and the cooperation we get. I heard that clearly. I heard what it meant. I set it aside for the moment because there was more, and I needed to hear all of it before I started reacting to any of it. The guardianship petition, I said. Tell me about the doctor. Aldridge and Croft exchanged a brief look. Croft took that one. Dr. Emmett Pryor, Croft said. The name is real. He's a licensed physician in the state, family practice, semi-retired. We spoke to him yesterday afternoon. He paused. He has no record of ever seeing you. He has no record of ever conducting a cognitive evaluation of any patient matching your description. When we read him the language in the petition's supporting letter, he was, Croft chose the word, alarmed. He said the letter used his name and license number, but was not authored by him. Derek forged the physician's letter, I said. Yes. We've sent the document to a forensic documents examiner, but based on Dr. Pryor's denial and the fact that his office has no corresponding records, we're treating this as forged. That adds a separate charge, fraud upon the court, filing false documentation in a legal proceeding. I pressed the heel of my hand against the table, not in anger exactly, in the specific physical need to push against something solid. He built the whole thing, I said. The small transfers to drain the account gradually, the shell company to receive them. Moving back in to monitor me, learn my passwords, make sure the plan stayed on track. The forged medical letter to take my legal standing, the cabin to get me out of range while he executed the final step. I looked at Aldridge. He wasn't in a corner. He wasn't desperate. He planned this the way you plan a project. That's consistent with what the evidence shows, Aldridge said. He said it neutrally, but there was something behind the neutrality that I recognized. Not pity, but something like it. The recognition that this particular kind of betrayal, the long game kind, was somehow worse than an impulsive one. An impulsive act you can almost understand. A 3-year plan is different. A 3-year plan means that every single day of those 3 years was something other than what it looked like. What do you need from me? I said. A formal identification of the transfers. Confirmation that none of them were authorized by you. Your attorney's cooperation in providing your asset documentation for the civil recovery case. And, Aldridge hesitated slightly, anything you can tell us about his current location or likely destination. The toll booth hit on Saturday put him heading east on E-Bahn 78. We've had no confirmed sightings since. He has friends in 2 places that I know of, I said. A man named Tully, last name I don't know, who he knew from a job in Harrisburg sometime in the last 10 years. And a woman, I don't know her name, who he mentioned a few times in the past year, someone he met online. He was careful not to give me details about her. Careful, Croft repeated, writing. Yes, careful. I heard that word come out of my mouth and felt the full weight of what it implied about how he had lived in this house. The thing about having your life savings methodically dismantled over 18 months is that you don't feel it happening. That's the engineered cruelty of it. Not a sudden blow, but a slow pressure. Invisible while it's building, catastrophic only when the structure finally gives way. I had balanced my accounts monthly. I had watched the numbers, but I had attributed the gradual decline to ordinary expenses. Medical costs, the furnace replacement 2 winters ago, a car repair. I had not looked for a pattern because I was not looking for theft from inside my own house. Gerald came by that afternoon after Croft and Aldridge left. He sat across from me and walked me through what the civil recovery picture looked like, and it was the kind of conversation you have when you're trying to figure out what's left after something has been taken from a wreckage. The pension account was intact. Derek hadn't gotten to it, either because he'd run out of time or because it was in a different institution that required documentation he hadn't yet forged. The house was mine, deed clear, no liens filed. The $42,000 in small transfers was potentially recoverable if the domestic accounts could be frozen and liquidated before Derek accessed them. The offshore wire was the hardest piece. Best case, Gerald said, spreading his hands on the table, you recover 70, maybe 75 cents on the dollar over the next 12 to 18 months. The offshore funds may take longer. Worst case, and I'm telling you this because you've always wanted the real numbers, worst case, the offshore portion is gone. I nodded. What's the number? He told me. I looked at it for a moment the way you look at a wound before you decide how serious it is. I can live on the pension, I said. The house is paid, I can live. You can, Gerald said. It's not what you worked for. It's not what should have happened. But yes, you can live. Then that's where we start, I said. Gerald looked at me with the expression of a man who had expected this conversation to be harder. Harold, most people in your situation spend the first week in a state of, I spent 41 hours in a freezing cabin deciding whether I was going to walk 8 miles on a bad knee or wait for rescue, I said. I've done the falling apart portion privately. I'd like to move to the reconstruction portion now. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, all right, let's talk about reconstruction. Lena called 3 days later. Not in her official capacity. She said that up front, which I appreciated. I'm calling as someone who found you in a cabin and would like to know how you're doing, she said. You can tell me it's none of my business if you want. It's not none of your business, I said. You're one of 3 people who know the full picture, and the other 2 are a lawyer and a deputy, so you're the most useful person to talk to. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. How are you sleeping? Better than I should be, probably. That's actually normal. The body catches up on what it missed. A pause. Have they found him? Not yet. I looked out the kitchen window at the maple. The last of the leaves were coming down now, the October wind stripping the branches clean. He had a head start, and he's not stupid. Moving offshore was the right call from his perspective. It buys him distance while the legal process moves at its pace. Does it bother you, not knowing where he is? I considered the question honestly. Less than I expected. What bothers me more is the timeline. Knowing it started 3.5 years ago, knowing that when he called me about the fall getaway, I was happy because I thought we were getting better, and he was calling me because everything was in place. Lena was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about something you said at the cabin, she said finally, about making excuses for him. I said I'd spent 46 years doing it. You did. And I've been thinking. You said it like it was a failure, like you should have seen through him sooner. She paused. I don't know if that's the right way to look at it. You trusted your son. That's not a character flaw. He's the one who made a choice about what to do with that trust. I sat with that for a moment. It wasn't a new idea exactly. Gerald had said something similar, and Croft had touched on it when we'd talked about the guardianship petition. But something about the way Lena said it, plainly, without trying to make me feel better, just stating what she saw, made it land differently. You're right, I said. I know you're right. It's just, I stopped. It's just that knowing something and feeling it are two different things, she said. Yes. Give it time, she said. Not a lot of advice I can offer, but that one I'm confident in. We talked for another 20 minutes about less significant things. The weather, the cabin, whether the county was going to fix the access road or gate it off. Normal things. It helped more than it should have, given the circumstances. When she hung up, I went to my office and sat at my desk. The desk Derek had gone through, the desk where he had found whatever paper records he'd taken, and I opened the lower right drawer. In the back of that drawer, behind a folder of old utility bills, was a photograph I had put there years ago, when Patricia's side of the bedroom became too much to look at every day. It was from before Derek was born. Patricia and I at a state park, summer, she's laughing at something off camera, and I'm looking at her instead of the lens. I was 31 in that photograph. I had no idea yet what the next 40 years would require of me. I held the photograph for a moment. Then I put it back in the drawer. I had work to do. The call from Aldridge came on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Lena had found me on the mountain. Derek had been located. He was in a city 4 states east. He'd been using cash and staying below the kind of electronic threshold that triggers immediate alerts, but he'd made a mistake. He'd used a credit card, an old one, nearly zero balance, that he apparently thought was beneath the notice of investigators who were focused on his bank accounts, to book a motel room. The card transaction triggered an alert through the fraud monitoring system linked to his identity, and from there it had taken investigators less than 6 hours to establish his location. He's in custody as of this morning, Aldridge said, picked up without incident at the motel. He was alone. I looked at the kitchen table, at the grain of the wood which I had looked at so many times over the years that I could describe it with my eyes closed. Without incident, I repeated. Yes, sir, he didn't run. He opened the door when they knocked. That surprised me slightly. I had imagined Derek running. I had built a version of him in my mind over the past 11 days that was always moving, always one step ahead, already on the next phase of whatever plan he had. The version who opened the motel door when investigators knocked was smaller than that version, more ordinary. What did he say? I asked. Aldridge paused. He asked for a lawyer. That's all? That's all. Not, I'm sorry. Not how's my father. Not even an explanation, which would at least have had the dignity of facing what he'd done. Just, I want a lawyer, which was his right, which was the practical, self-protective thing to do, which was, in its way, entirely consistent with the man who had spent 3.5 years building a careful structure around someone who trusted him. All right, I said. We'll need you available for the arraignment process in the coming weeks, Aldridge said. Your testimony, your financial records, Lena Brooks's ranger report, it's a substantial evidentiary package. The DA's office will be in contact. After he hung up, I sat at the table for a while, not processing exactly, I had been processing for 11 days, turning it over and over until the edges were worn smooth. Just sitting, just letting the information be what it was. My son had been picked up in a motel room 4 states away. He had asked for a lawyer. The money was partially frozen, partially offshore. The legal process would take months or longer. The forged physician's letter was sitting in a forensic documents examiner's office, waiting to confirm what everyone already knew. The shell company, the transfers, the cabin, the guardianship petition, it was all there, all documented, all building towards something that would eventually, in the way the law worked, have an outcome. What I was feeling was not triumph. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect triumph in moments like this one. The arrest, the vindication. What I was feeling was closer to a deep, structural exhaustion. Not physical, though my knees still complained about the mountain, but the exhaustion of a man who had spent 11 days holding himself together through force of habit and useful activity and the practical necessity of cooperating with investigators, and who now, with the immediate crisis resolved, had nowhere left to direct that energy except inward. I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I was angry in a way that was too large to express cleanly. I was sad in a way that had nothing to do with the money. I called Margaret and told her they'd found him. She said, "Oh, thank heavens." Harold and I heard the relief in her voice, the relief of a neighbor who had spent 11 days watching my house with the particular vigilance of someone who felt responsible for not having noticed sooner what was happening. "Are you all right?" she said. "Working on it," I said. "That's the right answer," she said. Then I called Lena. She answered on the second ring and I told her, and there was a brief silence on her end that was not empty. It was the silence of someone absorbing news and deciding how to respond to it honestly. "How are you feeling?" she said. "Like it's over and like it isn't," I said. "Because the legal part is just starting," she said. "Not just that." I paused, looking for the right words. He was in a motel room, alone. He opened the door. He asked for a lawyer. I stopped. He looked at everything I'd built over 40 years and he decided it was something to take. And now he's in a motel room opening a door to investigators. I stopped again. "That's how it ends up," Lena said quietly. "For people who do what he did. Not in a dramatic way, just a motel room and a door opening. He didn't ask about me." She didn't try to explain that away or soften it or tell me maybe he had, and I just didn't know. She just said, "I know." "I raised him," I said. "I know," she said again. We stayed on the line for a moment without talking, which was the right thing. Sometimes the right thing is just someone on the other end of the line staying there while you figure out how to carry what you're carrying. "There's going to be a long process," I said finally. "Hearings, testimony, civil recovery. Gerald says 12 to 18 months minimum. You'll get through it." "I know I will." And I did know that. The 41 hours on the mountain had settled one question permanently. I was not going to be someone who quit when things got very hard. That had been tested in a way that couldn't be untested. "I've been thinking about the cabin," I said. "The county property?" "Yes." I looked out the window. The maple was bare now, branches clean against a gray November sky. "I've been thinking about what to do with whatever comes out the other side of all this. With what I have left and what I want to do with the time I have left." I paused. "I have some ideas." "Good ones?" "I think so. Not fully formed yet." "Tell me when they are," Lena said. I said I would. After I hung up, I went to my desk and found a fresh legal pad, not the one covered in notes from the past 11 days, but a clean one, and I sat down and uncapped a pen and started writing. Not a plan exactly, more like an accounting. What I had, what I'd lost, what could not be taken regardless of what had been taken, what I wanted the next chapter to look like. I wrote for 2 hours. My handwriting is not what it was. My hands stiffen in the cold, but the words came clearly and they were mine and no one had stolen them. That was more than enough to start with. The arraignment was on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after they found Derek in that motel room. I didn't have to be there. Gerald told me that clearly. My presence wasn't required at the arraignment itself, only at the later hearings where victim testimony would matter. but I went anyway. I put on my good coat, the charcoal wool one Patricia had given me for our 30th anniversary, and I drove myself to the Callaway County Courthouse and found a seat in the gallery and waited. I want to be honest about why I went. It wasn't for closure. I have never trusted that word, the way it implies a door that locks cleanly behind you. It wasn't for satisfaction, or not entirely. I went because I needed to see him in that room. I needed to see Derek as a man facing a specific set of consequences in a specific room with specific people who knew exactly what he had done. I needed to see him reduced from the figure he had been in my mind for the past 3 weeks, that constantly moving, always one step ahead version, to a man in a county courthouse answering to his name. He came in with his court-appointed attorney, a young woman who had the efficient composure of someone carrying too many cases at once. Derek was in clothes I didn't recognize, whatever he'd been wearing when they picked him up, I supposed, since he hadn't been home to change. He looked thinner than I remembered. Not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed. He walked with his eyes on the floor, and he took his seat at the defense table without looking at the gallery. Then, before the judge entered, he looked up. He found me immediately. I don't know how... The gallery wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. But his eyes went to me the way a compass needle swings north, like some part of him had known I was there before he turned around. We looked at each other across that courtroom for what was probably 4 seconds. It felt longer than that. I had rehearsed this moment in my head without meaning to, the way you rehearse things you tell yourself you're not preparing for. I had imagined various versions of his face, defiant, calculating, blank. I had thought about what I would feel when I saw him. What I saw in his face was something I had not expected and was not prepared for, which was that he looked like a man who had been awake for 3 weeks. Not guilty exactly. Derek was too practiced at self-justification to arrive at guilt quickly. But something had gone out of him. Some forward-moving energy that had always defined him, that restless, calculating momentum, was absent. What was left without it was a face I recognized from a long time ago, a face that was tired and younger than it wanted to look, and underneath everything, scared. He looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like my son. I didn't look away. I didn't nod. I didn't give him anything that could be read as either forgiveness or hatred, because neither of those was what I was feeling. What I was feeling was more complicated and more permanent than either of those things, and it belonged to me, and I kept it. After 4 seconds, he looked away, back down at the table. The judge entered. The proceedings began. Gerald had prepared me for the rhythm of it. The charges read, the plea entered, the bail conditions set. Derek's attorney entered a not guilty plea, which Gerald had predicted, and which meant nothing yet except that the process was beginning. Bail was set at an amount that reflected the seriousness of the charges: financial fraud, document forgery, fraud upon the court, and the one that carried the most weight in that room, criminal endangerment of a vulnerable adult. That last charge was Croft's edition, built from Lena's Ranger report and the medical record confirming my exposure symptoms and the topographic analysis of how far I was from any help. Derek couldn't make bail. The accounts were frozen. Whatever he'd carried in cash from that motel room wasn't enough. He was remanded to county holding. I watched them take him out, and I sat in that gallery for another minute after he was gone, not because I needed more time, but because I wanted to mark the moment. Just sit in it for a second and let it be real. Then I put my hat on and buttoned my coat and walked out into the November cold. Gerald was waiting on the courthouse steps. He fell into step beside me without making it a production. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," I said. And it was true, which surprised me slightly. "The DA is confident on the primary charges," Gerald said, back to business, which was how I preferred it. The forensic documents examiner confirmed the physician's letter was forged. Derek used a typeface that matched a common template, but the paper stock and ink composition are inconsistent with Dr. Pryor's actual letterhead. Combined with the financial trail, the shell company, and the toll booth records, it's a substantial case. Timeline on the trial? 8 to 12 months, possibly longer depending on whether he changes his plea. Gerald glanced at me. If he pleads out, it likely shortens the process, but also limits some of the civil recovery. We'd need to weigh the options carefully. "Let me know when there's a decision to make," I said. We reached the parking lot and Gerald stopped. "Harold," he said, in the tone that meant he was going off script. "I've known you for 20 years. I know you're not going to fall apart on me, but I want to ask you directly. Are you managing this? Not the legal part. The other part." I looked at the parking lot. At my car, the sensible 10-year-old sedan I had driven for a decade because I didn't need anything newer. At the bare trees along the courthouse perimeter and the flat November sky above them. "Some days better than others," I said. "That's the honest answer." Gerald nodded. "That's the right answer," he said, which was almost exactly what Margaret had said, and I found I appreciated that both of them said it the same way. Like some days better than others was not an admission of weakness, but simply an accurate reading of a situation. December came in cold and stayed that way. The legal process moved at its pace, which is to say, slowly, and with a great deal of paperwork that Gerald managed and I reviewed and signed. The civil recovery case ran parallel to the criminal case, which Aldridge had explained was standard. The criminal prosecution and the financial recovery were separate tracks, and the criminal conviction, when it came, would support the civil case but not automatically resolve it. Frozen domestic accounts were being liquidated into an escrow holding. The offshore wire remained the contested piece. The funds had moved through 2 intermediary accounts before settling in a jurisdiction whose cooperation with U.S. financial investigators was, in Aldridge's careful phrasing, inconsistent. I had made my peace with the possibility that the offshore portion was gone. Not quickly and not cleanly, but I had arrived there. It was a significant amount of money. It was money I had saved over 4 decades of careful living, money I had intended to leave behind me when I died in a way that meant something. The loss of it was real, and it was not nothing. But I had looked at what remained: the pension, the house, the frozen domestic accounts coming back to me in installments. And I had made the calculation Gerald and I had made that first night home. I could live. I could do more than live. What I found, in the months after Derek's arrest, was that the loss of the money was not where most of my attention went. This surprised me. I had expected the financial devastation to be the central thing: the $42,000 in small transfers, the cashier's check, the offshore wire. But when I was honest with myself about where the weight actually sat, it wasn't on the accounts. It was on the timeline. 3.5 years. Every time I sat at the kitchen table, I was sitting at the table where he had eaten dinner with me during those 3.5 years. Every time I walked into my office, I was walking into the room where he had gone through my papers at night while I slept. Every time I looked at the photograph of Patricia in my desk drawer, I thought about the fact that he had looked at that photograph too, had walked past it, had made calculations in the same house where it sat. That was what cost me sleep on the hard nights, not the money. The retrofitting, the way every memory of those 2 years he'd lived here had to be re-examined and recontextualized, stripped of the meaning I'd assigned it at the time and seen clearly for what it actually was. Those dinners weren't reconciliation, they were surveillance. That helpfulness wasn't a son growing up, it was a man on a long job. The person I was angrier at on the hard nights was not Derek. It was the version of myself that had so badly wanted the dinners to mean what they looked like, that I had not looked harder. Lena said, when I told her this, we'd fallen into a pattern of occasional calls, once every couple of weeks, that had become something I looked forward to without analyzing too carefully. She said, "You're doing the thing where you hold yourself responsible for his choices." "I'm holding myself responsible for my own choices," I said. "That's different." "Is it?" "Yes. He chose to steal from me. That's his. I chose to trust someone I'd been trusting my whole adult life. That's mine to look at honestly." I paused. "I'm not saying I should have been suspicious of my own son. I'm saying I made it easier than it needed to be. That's worth sitting with." She was quiet for a moment. "You're harder on yourself than you are on him." "Probably. He'll have a judge. I have to be my own." She thought about that. "Fair," she said finally. Those conversations helped me more than I expected them to. Not because Lena had answers, she didn't pretend to, but because she listened the way someone listens when they're actually interested in what you're working through, rather than waiting for a pause to insert a resolution. That kind of listening is rarer than people think. The plea came in February. Derek changed his plea to guilty on 4 of the 6 counts. financial fraud, fraudulent transfer, fraud upon the court for the forged physician's letter, and criminal endangerment. He maintained not guilty on 2 lesser counts, which Gerald said was standard negotiating. The DA accepted the arrangement. Sentencing was scheduled for March. Gerald called me with the news on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in my kitchen, which is where I seem to receive most of the significant news in my life. He'll be looking at federal sentencing guidelines on the financial fraud counts, Gerald said. The endangerment charge carries additional weight given your age and the conditions. An elderly adult left in a wilderness location without communication or adequate resources. The DA has indicated they'll push for the higher end of the range. What does that mean in actual time? I said. If the judge accepts the DA's recommendation, 6 to 8 years, possibly more. With the fraud charges, there's also civil forfeiture of any assets traceable to the crime, the shell company accounts, anything remaining. 6 to 8 years. I did the math without intending to. Derek would be in his mid-50s when he came out. I would be in my 80s if I was still here. And the civil recovery? I said. The guilty plea strengthens our position considerably. The domestic accounts should be fully released to you within 60 days. The offshore piece, Aldridge is working with international regulators, and I want to be honest that it may come back in part. 40, 50 cents on that specific dollar over a longer timeline. No guarantee. Understood, I said. After Gerald hung up, I sat at the table and turned it over for a while. 6 to 8 years. A guilty plea. I'd expected to feel something definitive when this moment came. Some closing of an account, some settling of a balance. What I felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the particular exhaustion that comes when you've been braced for impact for a long time, and the impact finally comes, and you find you're still standing, but the bracing itself has cost you something. I was still standing. That mattered. I held on to that. But the sentencing was on a Thursday in March. Gerald had asked again if I wanted to be there. I said yes again, for different reasons than the arraignment. This time I was asked to provide a victim impact statement, a written account of what Derek's actions had cost me, not just financially, but in the totality of it. I had written 3 drafts. The first was too angry. The second was too measured, too careful, so well organized that it had no blood in it. The third was honest. I stood in that courtroom and I read it in my regular voice, which is not dramatic. I have never been a dramatic man, but which was steady and clear and held what I needed it to hold. I told the court that what had been taken from me was not only money, though the money was real and the loss was significant. I told them that what had been taken was a version of my own history, 2 years of what I had understood to be repair between a father and a son, which had turned out to be something else entirely, and which now had to be carried differently. I told them that I had spent 41 hours alone in a mountain cabin in October cold, wondering whether my son had left me there to die, and that I had decided in that cabin that I was not going to die, and that whatever came next, I was going to face it standing up. I told them that the man who had driven me up that mountain had made a choice, and that I had not made him make it, and that I understood that now even on the days when understanding it was hard. I told them that I was 73 years old and that I intended to be useful for whatever years I had left, and that I did not intend to spend them defined by what my son had done to me. The courtroom was quiet while I read. I was aware of Derek at the defense table, aware without looking at him. When I finished, I sat down. The judge sentenced Derek to 7 years on the combined counts, with mandatory restitution tied to the civil recovery proceedings. The forfeiture of the shell company assets was entered as part of the order. There was language about supervised release conditions following the prison term, financial monitoring, restricted access to elderly family members. Gerald shook my hand outside the courthouse. That statement was the right thing, he said. It was the true thing, I said. That's all. Bucked up. Spring came. The maple on Carmody Street put out leaves again, which it was going to keep doing regardless of what happened in my life, and I found that continuity comforting in a way I hadn't expected. The domestic accounts were released in April, 62 days after the guilty plea, just as Gerald had estimated. The number that came back into my possession was not the number I had saved over 40 years. It was diminished by the offshore loss and by the legal costs and by whatever Derek had spent in the weeks between Saturday the 8th and the motel room. But it was real money. It was mine. I held the account statement for a moment and then filed it where I kept financial records and didn't look at it again for a week, because some things you need to let settle before you examine them. Lena came to dinner in April. Not a formal arrangement. She called one afternoon to say she was coming through my side of town for a county meeting, and I said if she wanted dinner afterward, I was cooking. She said yes without making it complicated, which was consistent with everything I knew about how she moved through the world. I made pot roast, which I hadn't made in years because it seemed like too much effort for one person. It took all afternoon, and the house smelled right for the first time in a long time. She arrived at 6, still in a ranger jacket, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Aldridge had shown me the transfer records, the same table where I had received all the significant news, and ate pot roast and talked, and it was the most ordinary evening I had spent in 6 months, and it was, in its ordinariness, exactly what I needed. "The cabin," she said halfway through dinner. "You mentioned you'd had ideas about it, back in November." "I remember." "You never told me what they were." I set down my fork. I had been thinking about this for months, turning it over, testing it against the practical realities of what I had available and what I wanted and what might actually work versus what was just a good-sounding idea in my head. "The county owns it," I said, "but county property gets repurposed all the time. They've been trying to figure out what to do with that parcel for years. It's not useful as active forestry land. It's too remote for recreational development." "That's accurate," Lena said carefully. "I've been in contact with the county administrator," I said. "There's a process, a proposal process, for private organizations to lease county property for a designated community purpose. Long-term lease, nominal cost, in exchange for maintaining the property and operating whatever the designated purpose is." Lena had her fork midway to her mouth. She set it down. "What are you proposing to use the cabin for?" I told her. She was quiet for a long moment. Not the kind of quiet that means disapproval, the kind that means someone is taking something seriously enough to sit with it before they respond. "That's going to take real money," she said finally. "I know. I've been working on the numbers." I got up and went to the counter where I'd left the notepad. The clean one, the one I'd started writing in that first night home. I brought it to the table and she looked at the pages of figures I'd been building for months. "You've been planning this since November," she said. "Since the cabin," I said. "Since I was sitting in that room trying to figure out whether to walk 8 miles or wait. I had a lot of time to think about what I wanted to still be standing for." She looked at the notepad for a while, at the numbers and the rough drawings and the notes I'd made about structural requirements and access and what it would take to make a remote mountain cabin functional for people who weren't rangers or engineers. "It's not going to be easy," she said. "I know. The access road alone is going to be a project." "I know that too." I sat back down across from her. "I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for something worth doing." Lena looked at me across the kitchen table. The same table where this whole long thing had started, where Derek had eaten dinners while planning what he planned, where I had received the news that he'd taken the money, and the news that he'd been caught, and the news that he'd pled guilty, and the news that he was going away for 7 years. That table had held a lot of the weight of the past 6 months. "I could help," she said. "Not officially. County employees have restrictions, but the access road, the structural assessment, what the property would need, I know that land better than most people. Unofficially." "Unofficially would be appreciated," I said. She picked up her fork again. "Tell me the rest of it," she said. "All of it." So I told her. I talked through the whole plan, the shape of it, the purpose, what I wanted it to be, and for whom. It was the first time I had said it out loud to another person, and saying it out loud made it more real, and also more daunting, and also, somehow, more clearly right than it had been on paper. We talked through dinner, and through the clearing of the table, and through 2 cups of coffee afterward. By the time Lena left, close to 9 o'clock, we had covered every page of that notepad, and I had 3 more pages of new notes from the conversation, and the thing in my chest that had been tight and contracted for 6 months had loosened slightly. Not gone, not resolved, but loosened. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her truck pull away from the curb And then I looked at the dark maple and the April night behind it, and I thought about Derek in a county holding cell 400 miles away with 7 years mapped out in front of him, and a version of his life that was going to look very different when it resumed. I thought about the motel room door opening. I thought about his face in the courtroom at the arraignment, the exhaustion in it, how young and frightened he had looked underneath everything. I did not feel sorry for him. That would be more than I had available, and I was done pretending I had more available than I actually did. But I didn't feel the anger either, not in that moment. The anger had done its work and quieted down to something I could carry without it occupying every room. What I felt was something I didn't have a clean word for, a kind of settled sadness that acknowledged everything that was true, what he'd done, what I'd lost, what couldn't be recovered, and held all of it without trying to resolve it into something neater than it was. Life at 73 had taught me that most things don't resolve into something neater than they are. Most things just become something you learn to carry while you keep moving. I turned off the kitchen light and went to check the furnace and lock the front door, the ordinary end-of-evening tasks of a man in his own house. And I thought about what I'd told Lena over dinner and what she'd said back to me, and what the notepad full of plans meant about what was coming. 7 years. That was Derek's road. And this? The notepad, the lease proposal, the county administrator's email waiting for my response, the access road that needed work, the idea that had been growing since a cold October morning in an abandoned cabin. This was mine. We were going in different directions now, my son and I. His road had a term and a set of walls and a supervised end. Mine had only as much time as I had left, and whatever I decided to do with it, I had decided. The county lease was approved on a Wednesday in June, 14 months after Derek had driven me up that mountain road. I remember sitting in the county administrator's office when they slid the document across the desk, and I remember picking up the pen and feeling the particular weight of a moment that has been built toward slowly enough that when it arrives, it is both expected and still somehow surprising. I signed my name in the same deliberate handwriting I'd used for 41 years on engineering documents, Harold R. Whitmore, and set the pen down and thought, all right then, here we go. The terms were what Gerald and I had negotiated over 4 months of back and forth with the county. A 15-year lease on the parcel at nominal cost, $1 per year, which was the county's standard arrangement for designated community purposes. In exchange, I was responsible for all renovation, maintenance, insurance, and operation costs. The designated purpose, written into the lease in plain language, was this: a short-term residential retreat facility for senior adults who had experienced homelessness, family abandonment, or financial exploitation, offering temporary housing, meals, and connection to social services. The county administrator, a practical woman named Doris Hatch, who had been doing this job for 20 years and had seen a lot of proposals, had looked at me over her reading glasses when I'd first presented it and said, "Mr. Whitmore, you understand this is the cabin where your son left you." "Yes," I said. "And you want to turn it into a place that helps people who've been through situations similar to yours?" "Similar," I said. "And different. There are a lot of ways a person ends up with nowhere to go." She had looked at me for a long moment. Then she'd said, "The commission will review it," in a tone that told me she intended to make sure the commission did exactly that. That had been 4 months ago. Now the lease was signed and the work could begin. I want to tell you what the renovation cost me, not just in money, but in the full accounting, because I think that matters to understanding what this place became. The savings I had recovered, the domestic accounts, the shell company assets liquidated through the civil forfeiture order, came back to me over the spring in installments that Gerald tracked carefully. The offshore portion, after 14 months of international regulatory negotiation, came back at 43 cents on the dollar, which was better than Aldridge had initially indicated and still significantly less than what had been taken. When I added it all together and subtracted the legal costs and what Derek had spent in those weeks before the motel room, I had roughly 60% of what I'd had on the morning of October 8th. 60% after 40 years of work is not nothing. 60% when you own your house outright and have a pension that covers your basic needs is actually a foundation. But I want to be clear that it was not comfortable. Every dollar that went into the cabin renovation was a dollar I thought about twice. I got 3 contractor bids for every piece of work. I did what I could do myself, which at 73 with a bad knee was less than I would have liked, but more than nothing. I painted, I cleared brush, I built the vegetable beds in the back with Margaret's husband Ray, helping on the weekends because Ray is 68 and stubborn in the way that men of a certain generation are stubborn, which is to say, he showed up without asking and worked without complaining and accepted lunch and nothing else. Lena had been right that the access road was the biggest challenge. It needed grading and surfacing, and in 2 places where the mountain had pushed through, full reconstruction. That was the most expensive single piece. I stood at those 2 problem sections on a September morning with the contractor and my notepad and did the math 3 different ways looking for a cheaper solution before finally accepting that you cannot engineer your way around geology that has made up its mind. The cabin itself was structurally sound, old, but built by someone who had known what they were doing. The walls were solid, the foundation was good. What it needed was insulation, real heating, a bathroom that worked, a kitchen that could feed more than 1 person, and enough sleeping space to be useful. We added a second room onto the back. Modest, functional, nothing fancy, and winterized everything properly. And by November the place looked like what it was, a working building in the mountains that had been taken seriously. I drove up the newly graded access road for the first time on a cold November afternoon, almost exactly a year after Derek had driven me up the old version of it. I parked where he had parked. I sat in the car for a moment. The pines were the same. The sky pressed down the same way. The clearing in front of the cabin had the same particular quiet that I remembered from those 41 hours. That mountain quiet that is not peaceful so much as indifferent. The world going on at its own pace, regardless of what any individual human being is doing inside it. I got out of the car, I walked to the cabin door, a new door, solid wood, properly hung, and I unlocked it with a key that was mine and went inside. It was warm. The heating system was running. The interior smelled of fresh paint and new wood, and something indefinably lived in that the renovation had managed to preserve from the old structure. 2 rooms, the main common space with a proper kitchen along one wall and a table that could seat 8, and the added back room with 4 beds and a bathroom. Simple, functional. Not beautiful in any decorative sense, but clean and warm and solid. I stood in the middle of the main room and I let it be real for a moment. This was the room where I had sat on a cot for 2 days wondering whether my son had left me to die. This was the table. The old rough table, which I had kept deliberately, the one piece of the original interior I had not replaced, where Lena had made me eat soup and asked me questions, and written in her notepad and begun the process of getting me out. This was the wood stove, the same iron stove, cleaned and serviced and ready to work. I had turned the place where the worst thing happened into something else. I don't know if that qualifies as healing exactly. I am skeptical of the word healing when applied to things that simply have to be carried rather than cured, but it was something. It was agency. It was the decision of a man who refused to let the worst chapter be the last word. The first resident arrived in December. Her name was Evelyn, and she was 77 years old, and she had been living in her car for 3 weeks before Callaway County Adult Services found her through a coordinated referral network that Lena had quietly helped me establish over the summer. Evelyn's situation was different from mine in the specifics, and identical in the essential shape. A family member, in her case a daughter and son-in-law, had maneuvered her out of her home, out of her finances, and eventually out of contact with anyone who might have helped her. She had ended up with her car and the clothes in it, and a stubbornness that had kept her alive through November in a parking lot off Route 9. I drove down to meet her the afternoon Adult Services called. She was sitting in her car in the agency's parking lot, and when I knocked on the window, she looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately. Not fear exactly, but the particular wariness of someone who has been helped into bad situations enough times that they have stopped taking help at face value. "You the one with the cabin?" she said through the window. "Yes, ma'am. County says it's free. 30 days at no cost. After that, we work something out based on your situation. Nobody gets pushed out for not having money." She looked at me for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" It was a fair question. I had been asked it several times, by the county administrator, by Gerald, by Margaret, even by Lena in her direct way. I had different versions of the answer depending on who was asking, but the truest version was the one I gave Evelyn in that parking lot. Because someone found me when I needed finding, I said, and I had somewhere to go back to. Not everyone does. She studied me. Then she said, "You got a bad knee?" I looked down at my leg, slightly surprised. "Left one." "Yes." "Me too." "Right." She reached for the door handle. "Fine, let's go see this cabin." She stayed for 45 days. By the time she left to a subsidized apartment that Adult Services had located, the kind of transitional step the retreat was designed to support, she had helped me cook dinner for the 3 additional residents who had arrived in January, had reorganized the kitchen in a way that was, she informed me, significantly more logical than what I had set up, and had written a letter to her daughter that she showed me before she mailed it, not asking for approval, but because she wanted a witness. The letter was 2 paragraphs. It said she was alive and well and did not require rescue. It said she understood exactly what had happened and had documentation. It said she hoped her daughter would think carefully about the choices she had made and that she would not be waiting for an apology before she went on living her life. "Is that too cold?" Evelyn asked me. I read it again. "No," I said. "It's exactly right." She sealed it and stamped it and put it in the mailbox at the end of the access road on her way out, and I watched her drive away in her car, which ran better now because Ray had looked at it in November and fixed 2 things that were fixing themselves toward a problem. And I went back inside where 3 other people were having coffee, and one of them was arguing with another one about something I hadn't caught the beginning of, and the cabin was loud and imperfect and warm. Okay. I need to tell you about the letter I received in February of the following year. I need to tell you about it because I've been honest about everything else, and this is part of the everything else. And leaving it out would be a kind of editing I don't think this story deserves. It came through Gerald, routed through the prison system's correspondence channels, which added a week to its transit. 7 pages, handwritten. Derek's handwriting that I recognize the way you recognize a person's face, even when it has changed. Gerald called to tell me it had arrived and asked if I wanted him to review it first. I said no. I said I'd read it myself. I sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with the letter and a cup of coffee, and I read all 7 pages. I am not going to tell you exactly what it said because some things belong to the people they were said to and not to a wider audience, but I will tell you the shape of it. It was not a simple apology. Derek was never simple, and a simple apology would not have been credible from him anyway. It was an accounting, as close as he was capable of coming to one, of how he had told himself the story of what he was doing while he was doing it. The story he told himself was, and this will not surprise you, a story in which he was owed. A story in which 46 years of feeling like the lesser priority, the second consideration, the one who had gotten the working too much version of me instead of the present version, had compounded into a debt he'd decided to collect unilaterally. I read that and I sat with it, and I tried to be honest about what was true in it, because some of it was true. I had worked too much. I had handed him money instead of time. I had not been the father I would have been if I'd known how to be. Those things were real, and they belonged to me, and I have never tried to put them down. But here's what I know, and what I knew sitting at that table on that February morning, reading my son's 7 handwritten pages. The debt he believed I owed him did not authorize what he did. It did not authorize the 3.5-year plan, the shell company, the forged physician's letter, the October morning, the 41 hours. A man who has been failed by his father has legitimate grievances. He can be angry. He can grieve what he didn't get. He can tell his father exactly what it cost him and demand acknowledgement. What he cannot do, what no grievance, however real, authorizes, is what Derek did. I wrote him back. 1 page. I said I had read all 7 pages of his letter. I said I acknowledged the things that were true. I said I was sorry, specifically and without qualification, for the specific failures that were mine. And I said that I would not be offering forgiveness at this point in time. Not because I was a hard man, but because forgiveness was not something I had available on a timeline someone else set, and I was done pretending to have things I didn't have. I said I hoped the 7 years gave him time to build something that actually belonged to him. I said I would write again if I had something to say. I sealed it, and I mailed it, and I did not spend the rest of the day on it. I went up to the cabin because there were things that needed doing, and work, I had found, was the most honest form of moving forward I knew. By the following spring, the retreat had housed 23 people. Not all of them stayed long. Some came for a week, stabilized, found a path forward with adult services help, and left. Some stayed the full 30 days. 2 stayed longer under extended arrangements because their situations required it, and because the rule I had set about nobody getting pushed out for not having money was a rule I intended to keep. What I had not anticipated, and this is the part I want you to hear because it's the part that still surprises me when I stand in the middle of it, was what the place became for the people who were there at the same time. I had designed it as transitional housing. What it became was also, unexpectedly, a community. Not the organized kind, not the kind with a structure and a mission statement, but the organic kind that happens when people who have been through similar things find themselves in the same room with time and warmth and a kitchen and no immediate emergency demanding all their attention. They talked. They argued. They told each other things they hadn't told the social workers or the county officials or the people who had processed their paperwork. They cooked together on Tuesday nights, which had somehow become a thing that nobody had decided and that I had simply stopped questioning. I sat at the old rough table some of those Tuesday evenings and ate food I hadn't cooked and listened to people who had been failed by their families in a dozen different ways talk about the ordinary things: weather, what they'd watched on the small television in the corner, what they were going to do next, what they were scared of, what they still wanted. It was in a way that I had not planned and could not have manufactured, the thing I had been hungry for without knowing it. Not the project. The people. The specific irreplaceable thing of being in a room with people who are alive and present and not pretending, not performing, not calculating what they can get from you, just there. Lena came up one of those Tuesday evenings in April, a year into the operation. She stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at the table. 7 people, 2 of them arguing about something, one of them laughing. Evelyn, who had come back to volunteer on weekends, sitting at the far end with her coffee. And she had an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. "What?" I said. "Nothing," she said. "It just looks like what you said it would." "Is that surprising?" She came inside and took the empty chair beside me. "A little," she said. "Most things don't." We sat at the table and someone put a plate in front of Lena without asking, and she ate it without making a thing of it. And the conversation moved around us the way conversation does when it belongs to a room rather than to any individual in it. And I am 74 years old now. I have a bad left knee and a pension and a house on Carmody Street with a maple that drops its leaves every October and comes back every April as if it has made a decision and intends to honor it. I have a cabin on the North Callaway Ridge that is warm in winter and full of people who needed somewhere to go. I have Gerald, who handles my legal affairs, and Margaret, who appears with food during difficult weeks, and Lena, who calls every couple of weeks and comes up to the cabin when she can, and is, I have come to understand, one of the genuinely good things that came out of the worst thing. My son is in a federal facility serving 7 years. I have written him twice. He has written back once. We are not at a resolution. I do not know if we will ever be at a resolution, and I have stopped requiring myself to know. Some things end cleanly. Some things just find a level where they can be carried, and you carry them, and you also carry everything else. And life is both of those things at once. What I want to say to you, directly, because I think you deserve directness after everything we have been through together in this story, is this. If someone is draining you slowly, it will not feel dramatic. It will feel like ordinary life. It will feel like expenses you can't quite account for, like explanations that almost make sense, like a version of love that keeps asking you to prove it by giving something up. That is not love. That is a transaction, and you are always on the wrong end of it. You have the right to protect what you have built. Every year of your life that went into building it, the work, the sacrifice, the patience, the getting up when it was hard, that is yours. It belongs to you. Not to whoever can make the most convincing case that they deserve it more. Not to whoever can make you feel guilty enough to hand it over. Not to a child you raised. Not to a family member who shows up with a story. Not to anyone who has decided that your trust is something to be optimized rather than honored. Your dignity is not for sale. Your history is not for sale. The right to stand in your own kitchen and know that what is in it is yours, that is not a small thing. That is everything. And if they have already taken something, if you are already sitting in the cold reading this and the truck has already driven away, I want you to know what I know from the inside of that experience. It is not over. The worst moment is not the last moment. The people who plan their betrayals carefully count on you staying down. They build their whole scheme on the assumption that the person they're stealing from will not have the strength to get back up. Get back up. Find the fire road on the map. Prime the pump. Make the call. Let someone bring you soup and ask you questions and write things in a notepad and drive you down the mountain. Let people help you. Let the process work. Imperfect and slow as it is. Stay in your house if your house is still yours. Make your list of what remains. And then, when you're ready, not when someone else decides you should be ready, but when you are ready, decide what you want to build with what you have left. You may have less than you started with. You will almost certainly have less. But you will also have something that cannot be stolen because it was not in any account he could access, because it was not on any document he could forge, because it lived in a place he never knew how to reach. The part of you that decided, in a cold cabin on a mountain in October, that you were not going to die in the dark, and you were not going to let this be the end of your story. That part is yours. It has always been yours. Build from there. I did. I am still doing it. And on Tuesday evenings, when the cabin is loud and warm and the old rough table is full of people eating food they cooked together, I sit in the middle of all of it, and I think about the morning Lena Brooks came around that bend in her Greene County truck, and about how close I came to not being here, and about everything that has happened since. It is not a perfect life. It is not what I planned. There are nights when the weight of what Derek did settles on me and I carry it through to morning, and that is simply the truth of it, and I no longer pretend otherwise. But it is mine. Every imperfect, hard-won, Tuesday evening loud, maple losing its leaves and coming back piece of it. It is mine, and I intend to keep it.